All right, this week we're looking at Christian architecture in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. And a kind of question tied up with this is tracking this long development, right? How do we go from the pre-Constantinian, relatively humble house church, the remains of which we see an example of here, to this stadium? I mean, it's kind of funny thinking about Roman context in the stadium, a stadium in which, you know, the same architectural format actually was, you know, thousands of years earlier, a place where Christians would have been killed by wild animals. But we go from this kind of humble house-turned church into the megachurch of the 20th and 21st century. And you can look at a space like this. This is the thing we'll be talking about, you know, this week as we're looking at the buildings. What does the arrangement of this space tell us about the community that gathers there? It doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of liturgical movement, right? Probably no processions in this space. People are going to stay in their seats the entire time. There's dark lighting with an emphasis on the stage. And it really is a stage in this sense, right? And not a, I mean, it's, we could say in the tradition of the bema, right? It's a platform that's raised so that people can see and hear the speaker. There's no altar. There's a podium there in the center, it looks like. I would take these to be choir members in the back. And then these multiple screens here, right? So that everyone can see and hear what's happening on the stage. Anyway, so to the megachurch, which we're actually, I'm not going to spend much time talking about the megachurch, to be honest. But before we get started, I wanted to just quickly summarize some points from Richard Kiekefer's book, Theology in Stone, Church Architecture from Byzantium to Berkeley. And in this, he kind of describes three broad traditions of church building. Now, I should note that all churches probably have elements of each of these. So it's not, these aren't exclusive, but they're kind of more like overlapping categories. A church tends to favor one over the other, though. So let's move through these kind of quickly. The first is the classical sacramental church. These also move, these three categories move chronologically in that way too, right? So this would go back to the churches that we saw in our first lecture on Christian architecture, so dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries, especially. And they continue today, though. We see examples of this in Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholic and Anglican churches, Episcopal churches. So in other words, what would be called like liturgical traditions. Tends to be a basilica plan. So that longitudinal reorientation of the Roman civic basilica that we saw, and kind of contrasting what I was just saying about the megachurch a moment ago, that organization of the space tells us what's important to the community, right? So it's not surprising that liturgical traditions would use a basilica plan because there are going to be processions. There will be some movement, individual and corporate movement. And there is, you know, the main, in those traditions, the kind of pinnacle of the liturgy is the Eucharist, not the sermon. And so the procession of everyone to the altar and to the altar area is reflected in the organization of the space. Also, it would say evokes God's immanence through the use of height, especially the space over the altar will be the highest, will have the highest ceiling. So it's communicating things about the community, about the liturgy, and about the theology of the community and their perspective on the divine, right? The classic evangelical church, which dates to the Reformation, will be primarily found in Protestant churches, and we'll see an emphasis on the preaching of the gospel. So instead of the altar, the pulpit is the focus. And it's more like an auditorium plan, meaning kind of fanned out like that, because then hearing, like I was just saying actually about the megachurch there, but because hearing and seeing the speaker who's preaching or who's reading the gospel is going to be the most important. Now, there's also there were already pulpits, before Protestantism. So Catholic churches also had pulpits for reading the scripture and for preaching. But we'll see an example in which the pulpit is literally at the center, and one of the churches we'll look at. So, and then the modern communal church. So this is one that's found in Protestant and liturgical churches. We'll look at one example at St. John's in Collegeville. But what I mean by emphasis on the gathering, the community, is when we're looking at these spaces and when you're designing your own, to think about how does, physically, how does the community gather in this space? How do they enter it? How do they congregate? Where do they sit? What's their relationship to other people in the space, especially to people in leadership? In a church that emphasizes the gathering, there's not going to be one main aisle, right? Because that leads to one kind of way of entering, but usually that there will be multiple aisles and usually kind of fanning out, so that there's more of the sense of a crowd coming together than a procession, right? And also it's the case that in many modern communal churches you have transitional spaces and multifunctional spaces. So maybe maybe you have movable seating, or maybe you have like auxiliary rooms that function in different ways, or that your your entryway, what's related to the narthex of the early basilica, has different functions and so on, right? And by multiple and movable foci, I mean things like liturgical furnishings that can be, adjusted and moved around. So kind of a more multifunctional space. So these are things, as we're looking at the churches that we're going to talk about today, and then in class together, we'll be looking at more recent contemporary examples of Christian churches, that you kind of look for elements of each of these and think about what the design of the space might tell you about what's important to the community, assuming that there are choices being made. So we're gonna back it up to the Protestant Reformation. We ended our previous class about pre-Reformation Christian architecture. We were looking at the Gothic period, and we ended by talking about the Cathedral of Notre Dame. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but to say that the Protestant Reformation, as you might imagine, if you've already had your historical theology class, you should know that the Protestant Reformation is a really important turning point in the history of Christianity, beginning with Martin Luther, and then with the German, the Lutheran Reformation in Germany, and then continuing with the Swiss Reformation by Zwingli and Calvin and others, and English Reformation and so on, right? So it kind of spreads throughout Northern Europe especially. And they're initially, in Luther's case, critiquing the selling of indulgences, and then that kind of ripples out into critiques of the papacy as an office, alleged abuses of power, issues like having clergy who are not sufficiently educated and trained to fulfill their duties, and so on and so forth. In the case of Zwingli and Calvin in particular, there were also bouts of iconoclasm that were targeted at churches, and this is often in Switzerland and the Netherlands. And this is very well documented, and I can, if you're interested, get you some resources. But what happens is we're seeing one image here, a contemporary painting of iconoclasm in a church. So folks are pulling down statues. On the right-hand side over here, we see a statue that's been broken off, right? So they're pulling down statues, and in some images, let's see, I have another one here. This one's a little bit more action-packed. So here they're actually pulling down a cross of Jesus from on top of the altar. And it's interesting because you have and this is called image storm. That I think the artist is making an intentional parallel, right, between the historical crucifixion of Jesus and iconoclasm. So you have the statue of Mary here that's kind of mourning it, and a figure up on a ladder, which the ladder is one of the instruments that's depicted in the Arma Christi, or the instruments of Jesus's passion. But this fellow is using it to pull down and damage images. So they're smashing statues, they're pulling them down, they're breaking them, they're taking down paintings, breaking out windows. And in part, it was actually not so much about idolatry, and although there's lots of language around idolatry, but it wasn't so much about the second commandment and what's interpreted as the prohibition against human-made images, but it was probably more so about what was allegedly the misallocation or misuse or mishandling of material wealth by the Catholic Church. And some reformers and there were some reformers who were preaching pretty explicitly encouraging iconoclasm. And we have sometimes individual acts of iconoclasm, but then there were also documented mob violence that, and as depicted in this image, that occurred after some reformers, including Zwingli, preached against images. So, but they're critiquing, and some of these folks who were destroying the images would say that the church should be spending this on the poor. They wanted to take this material and say if it's made of metal and melt it down and give it so that to help the poor, right? What this results in the aftermath of iconoclasm is churches in Northern Europe that have whitewashed walls. Their stained glass window has been knocked out and replaced with clear glass. Paintings have been taken down. Altars have been stripped. It's now an imageless. It's still it still has that basilica plan, but it's imageless, right? So the whitewashing of the churches here. And one more thing, a thing that's interesting to me about like this image, for example, is that it's a little, I have a hard time getting a sense of where we're looking at here. Like it seems like the altar is up here. But the space is being represented in this way that it's kind of hard to tell, because if this is the nave, then this kind of feels like it's in the way. So there's something kind of, to me at least, ambiguous about the way the space is being represented, because with this monumental cross up here, that would make me assume it's the altar. Otherwise, I would say maybe it's a side chapel and we're looking at it in a crossway. So anyway, it's a little disorienting. But one thing I wanted to note, and in this one too, isn't it? Just thinking of our plan, because if this is the high altar, it goes back. So maybe this is an altar and there's another high altar back there. I don't know, but the space to me represented in these is a little disorienting, and I guess that's probably an intentional choice. It makes sense. But what I was going on about there is that that longitudinal space is no longer really relevant or necessary for Protestant churches. Yes, the Eucharist, and especially for Luther, for example, the Eucharist is still a sacrament and is being celebrated and is important. So you do still have that need for the altar in those traditions. But but there's also increased emphasis on the sermon. So sermons get longer, and this is when the introduction of pews happen, because people need to sit because they're really because the sermons are longer and so on, right? So that also, the introduction of pews tells us something about what happens in a space, right? What are the needs of the community? What are the furnishings they require? And how does that reflect or support what's happening liturgically? And so when you think about that megachurch image, that implies, in a sense, maybe this isn't altogether fair, but I think that implies in a sense that, and they're not even pews, right? Those are like movie theater seats, they're quite comfortable. So you're going to sit back, get comfortable. You're not going to be moving about. They're probably standing for worship and maybe dancing or moving their bodies in kind of a limited way if they're very close to other people. But they're largely receiving information, right? They're sitting and they're not moving very much. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind here is that Catholicism is, still going strong, and in fact has its own response to the Protestant Reformation. So there's the Counter-Reformation, which is the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation. There were other Catholic reform movements well before Luther's Protestant Reformation. So there were reform movements internal to the church centuries before the Reformation, and afterwards as well. So that's what I mean by Catholic Reformation. Counter-Reformation refers to the immediate Catholic response to Protestantism, right, to the Reformation. And it's largely focused on Luther in that first kind of generation. And so the Council of Trent is a very important response to that, in which the Catholic Church really doubles down on everything. They affirm the seven sacraments, because Protestantism is only asserting two. They affirm their own doctrine of justification, which is still by faith from their perspective, but they would say that the Christian has the ability to, and the choice and the free will to cooperate in salvation, right? So justification is through faith by God's grace. They would agree with the Protestants on that, but then they differ in that they say that after that, the Christian still has the ability to and should kind of cooperate or collaborate in the working out of their salvation with God. So I see the art period that follows this, which is the Baroque. It's really that you think of like Caravaggio and these and Bernini, these kind of like high drama images, and the buildings, as you see in the image on the right. This is a chapel that was Santa Maria Maggiore, is a 5th century church, but this is a chapel that was finished in the early 17th century. And I always think of the Baroque as kind of like the turning up the dial to 11. They're kind of like, okay, Protestants, we see you and we'll raise you like 1 million, and we're just going to put like lots of gold and marble. And this is also the opera is developing at this time as well. So it's like everything, they're just like, yes, and they're really doubling down on everything. So everything gets a bit more dramatic in the Catholic Church. So this is the kind of contrast that's happening, and these two trajectories are developing at the same time. Before we get into looking at some early Protestant churches in the Americas, I want to note a couple of elements that are up for grabs here, right? So as we're breaking away with the development of Protestantism and a distinct Protestant aesthetic, both architecturally and otherwise, church architecture, there's now more kind of like choices, right? when you are creating your own, when these new denominations are developing, then their own architectures are developing, and then they will have these questions. This is even more so the case in the 20th century, which is where we'll kind of eke into the 21st century, but into the 20th century. And not just for Protestant communities, but for Catholics and others as well. So the pulpit. Do you have one? Where is it located? Is it visually prominent, and how so? If you have a pulpit that's really elevated, like, is it elevated too much? Is it elevating the person, or is it elevating what they're saying, right? Is it elevating the word of God, because that's where you're going to read the scripture from? Is it fixed in one place or not? Seating, obviously, is the other kind of relational aspect here. Again, is it movable? Is there seating? Is it pews where people kind of shuffle in and out, and there's some movement there? You know, the pews aren't movable, but the people are within them. Or are there maybe chairs that can be moved around? And then what is the relationship between that seating and the altar space or the pulpit space? So is it quite linear if you think of that basilica plan, where there's just rows and rows and rows, and that might have a negative effect on some sight lines? Or is it more like a kind of auditorium, kind of fanning out seating? Again, thinking about how many aisles are there, how do people move through that space? For a Christian community that celebrates the Eucharist, whether it's, you know, once a month or every week, they'll likely have a table or an altar. So what I mean by difference between a table and an altar is that an altar is often, this is actually, I mean, it's very interesting. We didn't talk about, I don't think at the beginning of this semester earlier when we talked about early Christian architecture, but the earliest Christian altars were actually tables, because this won't surprise you, because they were trying to distinguish themselves from their pagan contemporaries, right? So as opposed to kind of the sacrifices that would be made on a solid stone altar in, you know, in a temple to Jupiter or something like that. So the Christians are using just a table. And there's also a functional reason for that. You know, it's cheaper, they can move it, especially, you know, before Constantine and the legalization of Christianity. That makes some practical sense as well. After the legalization of Christianity, the table becomes more, the altar becomes more solid again, and they kind of move back to often a solid altar that will have a cavity space where you can put a reliquary in it, because then it wasn't an official ruling until the 9th century that relics had to be installed in the altar, but it was common practice before that. So then there's this receptacle. Sometimes a relic could be attached to the cloth that's put on top of an altar, which would be the case for a table. Anyway, so whether you have a table or an altar, the reason for which one the community uses, again, whether it's movable, is it a permanent fixture in the space? Is it up against the wall, right? Their high altar. And so then the priest would have his back to the congregation. You may know that with Vatican II that changed, and that the altar was brought out from the wall, and then the priest would be facing the congregation. And the idea there is that it's with the congregation, and when with the priest's back to the congregation and the altar up against the wall, then the idea there is that the priest is actually with the congregation and praying on behalf of and with the congregation. But there's different ways that was interpreted hierarchically and things like that. And then in some spaces, the altar gets moved to the center. If you have a circular plan, or I mean, not a circular plan, a central plan, not the basilica plan. A central plan, you might have the altar and pulpit in the very center of a space, and then seating in the round throughout the room, right? Okay, the font, so this is for baptism. Again, whether it's movable, whether it's a fixed one that's built into the space, and then the size of it. So there's a question of, is it for children and or adults? That's, there's the practical accommodation, but then also, that has a visual kind of, well, a visual and theological impact, right? Because if it's, say, something that's in your storeroom and it's a tiny one that you just bring out for infant baptism, and then maybe for adult baptism, you go to a body of water somewhere in your community, which is the case in my particular church. Actually, our little baptismal font is not in it's not kept in a storeroom. It's kept in our entryway. So that you see it all the time. And so it serves as a visual reminder of baptism. There are some more modern spaces in particular where the baptismal font is incorporated in the nave near the entry of the church so that people see it every time they walk by. And the idea is that it's a reminder that you enter the church through your own baptism, right? And then if there's living water, running water going through it, sometimes folks might, say in a liturgical tradition, put their hand on the water and cross themselves, those kinds of things. But anyway, the point being that the size of the font, the location of the font, whether it's left open or covered, are all things that carry both practical and symbolic meaning, right? Okay, lighting in the church, again, for the pre-modern stuff we've been looking at, of course, it was lit either by natural light and or by oil lamps or candles. In the modern era with electricity, that changes, and there's a lot more customization that can happen. So then you're making choices about, do you want to keep a sense of natural light? Is there going to be dramatic lighting? Are you highlighting the altar through the light, or the kind of, if it's more stage-like and you might have a band, that kind of thing. Any artwork that's displayed in the space, and so on. The materials that the entire building is made out of also carry both like kind of financial impact, as we've seen in some cases, not economic, ecological, and then there's also potential kind of like theological or spiritual meaning, right? So wood is an obvious one in the Christian tradition because of the wood of the cross. Glass, whether it's stained glass or not, might be an opportunity for more images, or even abstract designs that create a particular sense in the space. Does it feel, if you're using like wood and stained glass, maybe the interior of your space feels quite warm, or maybe, if there's like red carpeting, things like that, create a certain kind of feeling. Or if it's made with concrete and clear glass, or there might be a cooler, more industrial feel to the space. And then how does that affect the sense during worship, right? Acoustics, of course, are very important for singing and for speaking in a space. The way that a space is designed, a building is designed itself without any kind of electronics or whatever, can help or hinder acoustics, right? And this is a big problem. It can be a big issue with it being in a historical space that maybe didn't have a great design regarding acoustics when it was built, and then the community needs to figure out how to update it and accommodate that, right? And then what level, what kind of sound system you have, and all those kinds of things. Okay, so those are just a few. These are just a few of the considerations. I'm sure you could think of others. Artwork I have kind of just mentioned in passing there, but that could really be a whole its own component, right? Of like, is artwork incorporated into the design of the building, or is it something that's kind of just like added on in a kind of ad hoc way? That's important too. Okay, so let's move through. We'll spend the rest of our time looking at some examples. And as you probably can tell, like there's no way that I can do that I could do a comprehensive survey of post-Reformation Christian architecture in one little lecture. That could really be a whole course. So I'm not going for comprehension here. What I'm actually doing, because I'm thinking of your final projects and the types of questions or issues you might have. So I'm going to show a couple of early American examples of early Protestant examples, but then I want to look at thinking about really the theme of this lecture, which I didn't quite intend as I was pulling it together, but it emerged, is that the theme of this is really modern church architecture that is interpreting the past, right? Whether it's trying to copy it exactly or interpret some of its essential elements. And those are all up for kind of interpretation. So we're just going to do a handful of examples here, and we'll start in the late 17th and early 18th century here. So this is a church in Newport, Rhode Island, which Rhode Island's really interesting because they have so many first churches and first churches and first religious buildings in America, including a synagogue. So, but we're just going to look at one. You could, if you ever get to the East Coast anytime soon, you could do a kind of sacred space tour there. But this particular community began as a congregation of Anglicans. They're now Episcopalian, but they began as a congregation of Anglicans in 1698. And actually it was a community of not just Anglicans, but there were Huguenots and Quakers also in their congregation. And so they had been meeting but were kind of, because they were growing, they needed a church. So they constructed this one. Oops. And there you go. So this is it in use, and I think you can still see the box pews, okay? And the box pews, so, oh dear, just knocked over my fan. The box pews served a couple of functions. One, sorry about that. They would keep you warm in the winter, because maybe now old buildings are quite drafty. So they would keep you warm. They're also good for containing toddlers and children. And the different families paid for their boxes. So that helped to defray the costs for the building. So basically it was kind of like an early Kickstarter campaign, right? And that means that the boxes are all different shapes and sizes. So they were built for the needs of those various initial families. And you might also notice the pulpit that's at the front of the space here, right? So this is a really unique pulpit because it's actually the only center aisle, freestanding, triple-decked pulpit in America today, and dates to the early 18th century. So a lot of this kind of colonial period, 18th century period, churches had central pulpits at this time, but they were often moved to the side later, in the church's life. This is not the case in this church. And so you can see there, the chandelier is a little in the way, but you can see there's one pulpit down here, and then you can go up here, and this is where the preaching would happen, right? And there's some, I wouldn't quite call it an altar space, right? But it's the equivalent of the altar space behind that central pulpit. And then you have two bays running along the side there for additional seating and good sight lines and hearing there, right? So what you probably noticed too is that all of the windows are clear. There are no images in the church. And also with a box pew, right, that also tells us people are not getting up and moving around during the service, right? You get in, you sit down, you might stand, say, for singing, or stand or kneel for other parts of the service, but you're not going to be participating in a procession, and you're not going to be moving around generally, right? Another early church is what's known as the Unitarian Meeting House in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Um, and this congregation initially was not Unitarian. So at the time of um, at the founding of it, of the building rather, the building of the building, um, it was a congregation of Presbyterians and Congregationalists, who at the time were known as Independents. Um, and so this was, we know, founded after the Act of Uniformity, which the Church of England issued, and the Act of Uniformity excluded any clergy who would not conform to his provisions. So they were known as nonconformists or as dissenting congregations, and that's what this one was known as. And so the the first minister was called in 1672. So this is well before, several decades before this particular building was constructed. They worshipped at a different house. But then eventually the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists parted ways in this particular community, and so the pastor, John Fairfax, who had been leading the congregation, stayed on with the Presbyterians, and they continued on there. But it was around that time that they came into community with Thomas Furman, who had been born in Ipswich, but was traveling internationally back to London as a merchant. And so he had a connection to the congregation and was kind of an attendant and influential and so on. The congregation still identified as Presbyterian at that time, but they were quite liberal, I suppose, compared to others. So all of this is to say that eventually the Presbyterians accept their exclusion from the Church of England, and they open this meeting house in 1700. And so they're really kind of, moving out of that. It was very, and I can move to an interior here. This is a terrible quality floor plan, but we'll see. So here's the pulpit and kind of the leadership, front of the house seating areas, box pews that we'll see, and then, or pews that we'll see, and then balcony here. So it was consistent with, kind of Puritan type worships. There were no musical instruments. Only singing was metrical settings of the Psalms. And the singing would be led from that reading desk that you see below the pulpit there. It's probable that the men were seated below and the women above. That's possible. But they became basically the congregation increasingly like increasingly liberal version of English Presbyterianism. Things kind of changed, or not changed for them, but they became finally Unitarian in the later 18th century. So this was, they had a minister at one time, Thomas Scott. So he was the minister from 1737 to 1766. And he was actually an Arabic scholar. And he was a friend to Joseph Priestley, who is known as a scientist, but was also a Unitarian minister. So basically, it was during this time that the congregation became, increasingly Unitarian, and they had several pastors over the years, or ministers over the years, that did that. What we're looking at here is that space. So you see a central, here's a central pulpit. It's not that tri-level kind, but central elevated pulpit. It has a little staircase here. There's a reading desk here. This looks like a movable podium there. They have a desk here, but that looks like a piano. And then box seating, clear stained glass windows, an organ, which would have been added later. So again, this tells us, the preaching and teaching of the word, the reading of scripture is very important, literally of central importance. There's no altar, and sight lines are very important here, aside from the columns that are obviously supporting the ceiling. And the use of box seats tells us that people aren't going to be moving about a lot once the service begins. I'd like to jump forward in time just a little bit briefly, and hop back to London for a second, or not back to London, but hop to London. This is the Church of St. Charles Borromeo in London, and the exterior of the church dates to 1863, but the interior of the church dates to 1978 through 80. So the interior was reconstructed in response to Vatican II. So there's a large table installed here in the center for the Eucharist. It's a big we're thinking of like Eucharist as heavenly banquet model, right? And you may notice the very large baptistry in the center. So this is what we're talking about, like where the baptistry is located tells us something, right? So this is big enough for immersion. And there's steps going down. I'll give you another image of this in a second. But the big thing is here, right? In order to take communion, you are walking past the baptistry. So this is reminding you, or the baptismal font, it's reminding you that you entered the church through baptism. The high altar would have been here. So post-Vatican II, they moved the altar forward so that now and you can see there's this, it's not quite in the round, right? But because it's a rectangular space, but there is kind of seating in the round in the sense that it's almost all sides. And so then the priest is in the congregation when administering the Eucharist and when performing the liturgy, right? So the baptismal font style that they have here is an ancient one and actually goes back to the earliest, it's modeled off the earliest Christian fonts, many of which were cruciform and descended into the ground. So they were below ground level and would have these steps so that the catechumen could descend into it. And they still couldn't quite press, they couldn't quite lay back necessarily fully, but could submerge themselves under the water, and then there'd be enough space for the deacon and or priest to come in there with them. And so maybe be partial submersion, immersion, partial pouring, sprinkling. yeah, I won't say any more about that. My doctoral advisor, Robin Johnson, has a really interesting book on the symbolism of early Christian baptism, how it was interpreted, and then what different fonts looked like. Some of them are very birth canal-esque. I'll just say that. Okay. So just a few years after the exterior of that, of St. Charles, the Washington National Cathedral was built. And you will notice immediately that it is built as a Gothic revival, or like a neo-Gothic style, right? You'll see the pointed arch, all of these pinnacles and finials, stained glass windows, and the kind of three portals here, the tympanum, all of these aspects that we saw in Gothic architecture. There are some buttresses here, but obviously with modern building techniques, they didn't, in the use of like steel and so on, they don't really need flying buttresses for this. It was built over a period of 83 years, though. You see that date. And it is very much an American interpretation of 14th century Gothic and English Gothic in particular. So here you can see those flying buttresses, kind of abbreviated flying buttresses. And then the transept would be right here, which has its own entryway as well. Floor plan. So this right here is where we were just looking. Baptistry, which I don't have an image of. And the altar. So here's the high altar, and then they have an altar moved out here, the pulpit for preaching, and then a podium for reading of scripture. And then this is the reverse view, going the other direction, rose window, additional seating, and so on. Let the cluster piers. And you can get some of those. That's nice, actually, the stained glass lighting up the walls. Interesting that, they chose not to paint the interior because it's a certain idea of Gothic architecture. There are 112 gargoyles and grotesques on the exterior of this building. And they're quite playful, as you can see. Here's a little demony mouse guy. This one's meant to be a yuppie that was apparently made for a particular executive. But they're monstrous ones. This one is kind of in commemoration of the mason who, he's got carving tools here. So on. But some of them are quite modern. So we have the Darth Vader gargoyle. That's a actual thing. So there's great humor and delight. And I can get a kick out of this and appreciation for the way that using, the iconography that's contemporary to the building to kind of serve as a gargoyle. Yes, it still always is kind of weird for me seeing this. I have to tell you, but I get a kick out of it. There was a devastating earthquake actually in 2011, which caused $34 million in damage to the cathedral. And that conservation and reconstruction has been ongoing. A lot of the gargoyles were damaged. There were sculptures. The exterior walls itself were severely cracked in some places. So it's been a really comprehensive, large-scale restoration project. But the reason that I'm showing you this particular building is because of this kind of like interpretation of the Gothic, right? And the interpretation of the Gothic cathedral, which brings to the question of style and designing a building, particularly a religious building, in a historical style. And they're not, I mean, yes, it's an interpretation, but they are obviously they're not loosely interpreting it, right? They're certainly trying to make it look like a Gothic cathedral. So the question is like, what does a church look like? What should it look like? I think before you get kind of sucked into those quotes, I should go back and say, um, I think sometimes, like, what is the reason? Here it is. What is the reason for designing a 20th century cathedral to look exactly like a Gothic cathedral? What are they trying to accomplish with that? What's the motivation for that? What might be the value in that, or the value that they think that they have, right? Because and here's the thing, I think when people think, oh, what does a church look like, they often think it looks like a Gothic cathedral. This is the idea of like, it's kind of like a not stock photo, clip art. It's like something like that. Yeah, maybe like stock photo. It's like our brain's stock photo version of like what a church looks like. It's shorthand for church, right? Because as we know, there's a great diversity in religious architecture for basically all traditions, right? All religious traditions, um, because they span cultures and time and so on, have really diverse architectural traditions. And the same is true of Christianity. However, in the kind of like, I think, contemporary mind, if you see a building that looks like this, you say, oh, that's a church, right? So it's like shorthand for church. And so this is the thing that we, appeal to. And in the, in the late 19th century, um, it was common for uh, for many for many communities, not just for churches, right? So I'm thinking of the way that universities often have like kind of neo-Gothic style or Gothic revival style architecture. For example, University of St. Thomas here in St. Paul does. The University of Oxford, a lot of their buildings date to the 19th century, and so there's this kind of like invocation of a certain kind of past, right, or an idea of the past. Yale University also has buildings that were built in the 19th century, and some that now are being like have been reconstructed. The Sterling Memorial Library, these things that are contemporary 20th and 21st century and have been made to look like they're Gothic. And of course, when you make a Gothic building in America, where there weren't buildings like this being created in the 12th century in the United States, there's a kind of ahistorical thing happening there too, right? So there's kind of many layers of interpretation, I think. Okay. So here's some quotes from different kind of architectural thinkers about revival styles, not just Gothic revival in particular. So Peter Hammond says, it's better to come before God naked than in period costume. So that gets at, if you think back to the beginning of our semester and talking about beauty, truth, and goodness, right? What should buildings do? How should they look? What does it mean for a building to be true, right? There's, the idea of beauty or aesthetics is one thing, and that's, pretty subjective. The idea of a building being good, meaning that it serves its function, it stands for a long time, it serves the needs of the community. But a building being true, it's like what it looks like, I think, in a sense. And I think that this quote gets at it, right? To create a revival style that's trying to present itself as to create a building in a revival style, and it's trying to present itself as a Gothic church. Is that true? What does that mean? And what does that mean in our nation's capital too, right? Okay. Duncan Stroik says that critiques modern churches for being bland, uninspiring places without clear focal points. So, and that this, he's critiquing kind of like minimalist modern aesthetic, usually undecorated walls, like lots of white or blank spaces, or, concrete, without a clear focal point too. So there's the going away from the basilica plan, you kind of know the orientation of that space. If you have and maybe that's also a critique too about lack of images or sculpture or thing like that. But think about that too as you're designing your spaces. How do you want somebody to move in that space? How do you want them to feel? Do you want them to feel oriented? Do you want them to feel like there's an anchor point? Say they come in and they sit down or they're standing. Where are they directing their gaze, or do they know where to look for liturgical action, so to speak? Okay. The Reverend Lord Lawrence Gibson says, if modern architecture is meant to be non-referential, Gothic architecture's whole purpose is to reference God. The building is a great finger lifted toward the sky. And I'm sorry, but every time I read that quote, I think, but he doesn't specify which finger. Anyway, yes, it's a great finger lifted towards the sky. So there is something about that Gothic architecture and their spire in particular obviously has a kind of physical height that makes us look heavenward. And it's true on the exterior and on the interior, that above the altar will be the highest space. And so we look upward, it's filled with light. And so there's a kind of thinking back to Pseudo Dionysius and Abbot Suger and so on, associating light and height with the divine. Robert Kiekefer, whose work I referenced earlier in the lecture, says that architects began to design churches that were meant to promote a sense of community gathered for celebration. These were buildings meant to blend into neighborhoods. And he's talking there and about that third point, the modern communal church. And that's a question too, right? Think about the neighborhood where you're building. What kind of relationship should that building have? Here I just mean visually, with the surrounding buildings, with the surrounding neighborhood. Are you gonna plunk a neo-Gothic style church, next to a park in a residential neighborhood, say in, I don't know, the south side of Chicago or something like that? Like, what resonance? There's different approaches to this. You could make a building that sticks out and intentionally contrasts with where it looks like. And that would certainly get people to pay attention, I suppose. Or you could think about the architectural history of the neighborhood, or the city, maybe if you don't know the neighborhood well, but of the city that you're constructing. And maybe your building wants to be in conversation with that. So maybe it will use materials that reference other buildings in the city, or maybe reference a body of water in the city, something like that, right? If you're building, just sticking with Chicago, and you've got Lake Michigan, what might you do to kind of have to incorporate your building into the landscape? So here's, and this is a building that was referenced in some of our readings earlier in the semester, and is a really interesting example, I think, of about relationship to landscape and also the function of the building. So this is a pilgrimage chapel. It was replacing a pre-existing church that had been bombed in World War II. I think that pre-existing church might have been even 4th century, but I could be wrong. But it replaced an ancient church, at the very least a medieval church. So it's a pilgrimage church. It gets something like 80,000 visitors a year. And it's on the top of a hill, but you actually can't see the building until you're almost upon it because of kind of how it's located. It is mostly concrete. The south wall is filled with rubble from the original site. So it actually has, and that's interesting to me, it's almost reliquary-like in that it incorporates, it reuses, it recycles the rubble from the previous building that had been bombed during the war. Okay, so this is a building, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it feels Smurf-like to me sometimes, but it's very organic, right, we could say. And none of the sides are exactly the same. So we'll kind of move around it and go into the inside. So we have a kind of bell tower here on the left. this sweeping building, which this is the highest point of the building here. And I mentioned it's a pilgrimage chapel that gets many, many visitors. So actually they also have, they have an exterior space, which we're looking at here, and an interior space. So here's the altar table. There's one pulpit, and then here's a little balcony from which it's also possible to speak and preach and so on. And then just some low benches, and then folks could be out on the grass. So that's one function here. And you can see this has this kind of great sweeping line. And we'll see some of these windows. You can maybe just make out those windows there. We'll see those from the interior in a second. So here's moving around to the left. There's the side we were just looking at. And here are these really deep, so you can see how thick the wall is in some places. These really deep cut windows, which again, we'll see from the interior. And here's on the right side of the little exterior altar area. More windows. One of the entrances. So here's the interior. And you can see how deeply cut that is. The windows are different thicknesses and different angles. In other words, it creates there's a very soft, very indirect light. It's very diffused. But it's, just panes of colored glass here. So it's also rather abstract. You may notice along the top, and here's the interior altars over here, you can tell. Along the top are very small windows. There's a better shot. That one was rather dark. So here's that same, the balcony on the other side is on the exteriors, and the other side of this, very similar kind of minimal cross altar. There's a kneeling area coming up to kneeling. And it's a pilgrimage chapel, so it's not accommodating a huge crowd in the interior. And again, you can see how thick the walls are there. The south wall, yeah, so this is the south wall. So this is the wall that the rubble is incorporated into, which is nice because the light is coming through that wall, right? Anyway, I was saying the windows along the very top here, very thin underneath this kind of big heavy roof, might remind you of, oh, I thought I had a thing there, might remind you of Hagia Sophia. And you think about the windows along the base of the dome in Hagia Sophia. Okay. But now we will go to Minnesota, a little place called St. John's University in Collegeville. And we're going to look at the Abbey Church there. Here's the larger campus. So this was built just within a decade of Notre Dame de Haute in Longchamp. And St. John's, if you're not familiar, in Minnesota, has had an important role in liturgical reform in the Catholic Church. So Virgil Michel founded the American liturgical movement in the 1920s and established the liturgical press at St. John's Abbey. And you've maybe had a book in your time at seminary that was published with St. John's Press. So it was designed by the German architect Marcel Breuer, who's you would associate with brutalist architecture. So that means lots of poured concrete, steel reinforced concrete. And that's very much the case here. So what we're looking at is the entrance to the church. And there's this, it's referred to as a banner, like a large bell banner. This is the north side of the church. So here's the bells there. There's a cross installed in that. The cross is made of oak that was harvested from the woods of St. John's Arboretum. And there are a total of 5 bells, although I only see 3 here. It seems like maybe 2 are out for repair or something. But the 5 bells are for call for worship. It was mostly constructed by local carpenters, and they made the form into which the concrete was cast. What else was I going to say there? And it's 112 feet high here. So it's an interesting community at St. John's because you have Benedictine monks, the students of the university and the seminary, and there's a prep school. There's also a parish attached to the monastery, and then all of the many visitors who come to the campus. There's also a retreat center just to the left of this. A little bit is a retreat center that's open to anybody. And then there's also the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library right over here, which we'll look at in a second. So the design of this church was intended that to accommodate all of these different constituents, right? So that all of the members of the community could participate closely in services. And so what Breuer, right? What Breuer did, or how he accomplished this, and we'll come back to this. See these honeycomb design. This is all windows there. It's kind of hard to see, but we have, thinking of the Gothic cathedral, 3 portals here. Oh, look, I know this image has all 5 back. All right, here's our floor plan, or elevation, I mean. So the side of the banner, entrance, so you can see the narthex, or the entryway, is quite low, and then you come into the church. That's really fun. So here we are in the interior. So it's a very large worship space, and there's no columns. Okay, so it's all very, very open. And it has a trapezoidal shape that lets you sit as close to the altar as possible. And I have a floor plan in a second that'll give you a better sense, because you can kind of see here's the kind of main aisle, but in fact there's several aisles for entering around, and the altar's in the center and has this suspended canopy, which is a kind of reference to the ciborium, which goes back to early Christianity and is a little kind of canopy over the altar. So here you are. Again, entryway and altar, and multiple points of convergence here. And they have auxiliary chapel. There's also, in the basement, they have the relics of St. Peregrine. And I think, I'm sure others too. I'm actually not sure how many. So it's a kind of more like a trapezoid kind of space here. Here's another view, opening above that allows light to come down to the altar. Not much in the way of artwork here, but there is colored stained glass on the ground level and above. And there's a little person back there. Gives kind of a sense of scale. Again, the windows, garden area. It does have a cool feel to it. And it is, I don't think I said this too, it's slightly raked, meaning that as you come in, you're going down towards the altar. So it's not quite stadium seating, but there is a slight elevation there, which helps for sight lines and sound. And, I just realized that I was going to talk about the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. And because of course I'm interested in the book part of it, but then forgot to include images of the building. But the Hill Museum Manuscript Library is one part of St. John's larger library, and their library is also designed by Breuer, I believe, and is poured concrete as well. So apologies for not including that image. You should check it out. I wanted to give a commercial for the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library because it's really an amazing resource to have in Minnesota, and they're doing such good work. So this is the, and they did a renovation, oh gosh, just in the last 6 years it was completed. So they've got these great individual study rooms and reading rooms and resources. But what I want to talk to you about is the work of Father Columbus Stewart, who's the executive director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. And, you know, he recently had a fellowship at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. You'll see him in, like, I don't know, he's always being reported on like the New York Times, or in being interviewed, I don't know, by major outlets and things like that. What's significant about the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library is that it's the world's largest archive of manuscript photographs in both microfilm and digital format. They're digitizing stuff that had previously just been on microfilm. And they began this work in 1965. And their archives contain more than 145,000 complete manuscripts and more than 50 million manuscript pages. Right now, their focus is on the Middle East, but they have partnered with communities all over the world. They especially prioritize places that are either, well, they prioritize places where the communities don't have enough resources for their libraries, and so manuscripts are in danger. So it's a preservation project. So what they do is they'll go to the location, they'll bring equipment, they'll train local people on how to digitize the manuscripts and like help them begin doing it. The local communities always get to keep the digitization files of their manuscript, but the agreement is then that it's also housed at St. John's. And in fact, I think that they have a secret mountain, totally safe repository where they keep things as well, in case of, you know, it's kind of that post World War II, Cold War, like in case they drop the bomb, like we're not losing these records of like human culture and history and so on. Anyway, it's all open access. You can find it through St. John's Library and V. Himmel, and they have grants for research and give public talks and all these kinds of things. So it's just a really great resource. They also commissioned, maybe you've heard of it, the St. John's Bible, which was the first Bible to be commissioned in 500 years, and specifically by a Benedictine community. You can see it's in a contemporary style. It's incorporating word and text. Donald Jackson was the head scribe. He's pictured here with a printed copy of it. And they had the benefit of computers to plan this out, but there were many scribes and artists involved in the project. Took, gosh, I wonder if it took a decade. And there was an exhibit at the Minneapolis Institute of Art when the project was still undergoing. But if you go to St. John's in Collegeville, they have it on display and you can see parts of it and so on. Anyway, not to belabor that point, but I'll end the little St. John's commercial with this image of the New Jerusalem as an example and just a little reminder that imaginative sacred space and place is as important in the Christian tradition as actual physical space, right? So, you know, we're talking in this lecture about some, you know, some physical, some constructed Christian sacred spaces, but as in some of the other traditions we've talked about, historical sacred space, biblical sacred space, you know, the mystical kind of imaginative experience of space and place is important. So this idea of spiritual pilgrimage through meditation and imagination and things like that is just as valuable. And I think as you're thinking about your final projects, you might incorporate that, or maybe that resonates with something that you're thinking about. Okay, by way of conclusion here, look at one more building. And since we're in Minnesota, we're in Minnesota in this presentation, I thought I would share with you my the humble little building of my community. So this is Holy Trinity Orthodox Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's this community was founded in 1916. It was largely a Russian immigrant community. It's still the case that we have many Russian and Ukrainian members. And in some ways, the Orthodox liturgy and architecture has not changed significantly in 2,000 years of history. The liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which was written in the 4th century and kind of updated in the 12th century, is still the liturgy that we use almost every Sunday. So here's the exterior. The main part of the church was built in 1916. This entryway here was added in 2014. It used to be there was a tiny little entryway with the stairs, so it was not handicap accessible. And we were given a large gift by one of our members who had passed away. And so the community decided to use it to make a more accessible entryway and to have a more proper kind of not lobby, because it's not quite significant enough for a lobby. But so one thing is that here there's a mosaic of the Good Samaritan. This is go and do likewise. So this is our kind of, as we're entering and leaving, to remember our kind of obligations out in the world. As you enter to the left, there's stairs that go down to the basement, which has education rooms and a coat room and bathrooms and a little library. And then you come up here, you can see that's actually our little baptismal font that I mentioned. That's really just for babies, but it's always there visible to us. And there's a little stand with 2 icons to kiss as you come in, and then the usual stuff like calendar, hand sanitizer, Kleenexes, and candles if you want to take them in. And this is an icon that was added with the expansion here in 2014. So it's Jesus entering Jerusalem with the phrase, so this is the, entering to Jerusalem before his passion. And the phrase going up to Jerusalem is one that is about pilgrimage. So thinking of our liturgy as a kind of pilgrimage, right, through sacred time. And the elevator is just around the corner right there. Here's a view from the inside. It's kind of hard to photograph the space, and this is an older photo, but this is during Holy Week, actually. So there's the epitaphos, the body of Jesus painted on it on the altar, and it's covered in flowers. This photo is taken from a small gallery, balcony up above. It's a chandelier, and the choir here, Hello Everybody sings, and you can see there's some big rugs on the floor, but it's standing room only with, in our case, pews that wrap around. So if somebody is, sick or old or pregnant or just plain tired, they can sit on the bench. And then during the sermon, folks will sit on the bench or sit on the ground. And here's what's called the royal doors. So this is a door that usually just the priest goes out of, but the deacons will sometimes, so the deacons come out of what are known as the deacon doors, right here, which is the good thief and the archangel. So the deacons will come out of these doors and sometimes go in through what are called the royal doors, or the main doors. And the altar is back there. You can see there's an image of Jesus here, administering the Eucharist, like in a kind of like heavenly communion kind of image. And then the Virgin Mary up here with baby Jesus and this like roundel on her chest. And it says, Mother of God, and then wider than the heavens, so that her womb is wider than the heavens, because she contained the uncontainable. But you don't ever tell a pregnant woman that her womb is wider than the heavens. What else was I going to say here? The door's open. Oh, the other thing is that in our case, the priest does face the altar, so back to the congregation, which I quite like in that he is in conversation with the Virgin Mary in that pose. He takes the same pose with arms up as Mary does there. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. So we also have stained glass windows. And then you can see some, here's Moses parting the Red Sea, Daniel in the lion's den. Our church is Holy Trinity, so we have an icon of the hospitality of Abraham, which is kind of interpreted as an image of the Trinity by Christian theologians. And then on our ceiling, also hard to get an image of, is Jesus as the Pantocrator there. Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward, I mean, there's not much going on to our church. It's just, you've got the main components of narthex or entry, nave, kind of the assembly space, and then the altar. We also have an auxiliary building across the street. That's a community hall that we share with folks in the neighborhood and stuff, and a garden. But sometimes Frank Lloyd Wright designs your church, and it looks like a wild Orthodox spaceship. So this is the Greek Orthodox Church in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. It was built in 1961. And initially, I mean, I see this and I'm like, whoa, it's pretty wild. But actually, when you take a minute to look at it, it resonates a lot with Hagia Sophia. Of course, you got the blue and the white because it's Greek. That's what you're gonna find. But we can already see some icon-like iconography in these windows here. There's a pool on the outside. Again, thinking about temple and courtyard and cleansing space and so on, like how we move into the church. But you look at the dome, this is a much more shallow dome, but it has those row of small windows around the base of the dome. We also have some larger windows, which is kind of the equivalent of the clerestory. And then this really interesting element that reiterates that shape, right, of the arches of the windows. And here's the interior of the space. It's very, I don't know, not quite Art Deco-y, because it's the 60s, but you see these like poles with lights on them, winding staircases up to the balconies. And again, we have some of the same elements even in, on my church. This is probably a stand for the choir here. We have the music stand. Music stand right behind that. And then this is like a podium with a little canopy over it. So we have the altar, the royal doors, which are open, another podium here, and the usual Mary on the left, Jesus on the right, John the Baptist in the Annunciation. And that image of Mary, very similar to the one that we saw in my church just a minute ago. So here's a little zoomed back view. There's really as much seating in the second row or on the balcony as there is on the main floor. But anyway, the reason I show this example, besides that it's kind of cool, and there's like this gold dome, is that it's really a distilling of historically Christian architectural symbols and structures. And we see this in so many 20th and 21st century churches, right? We're taking something like Hagia Sophia, which is a really unique, very ambitious building, has this circle it's both a central plan, with a central dome, and has still elements of the basilica because you have a large nave and a narthex and these side aisles and an apse, right? So it's a central, really describe Hagia Sophia as like a central basilica plan. But in the architecture that we've seen here and what we're going to look at in class together this week, be on the lookout for the ways, even as we've just encountered some aspects of Christian architectural history, that some of these floor plans and symbols and elements, thinking about the bema and the altar and the baptistry, how windows are used, all these kinds of things that are distilling or essentializing or referencing in different ways, even as they're reinterpreting them for the 21st century. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about these things this week.